All right, so you're here to really get into something complex, but in a way that doesn't leave you like completely lost,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
We're going to try to break it down. And today, that something is the world of Bob Camblin.
Okay.
Now, forget hours and hours of searching and reading through endless articles, because this is your focused deep dive into a truly original, if somewhat mysterious, artist.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have so much great material to work with here.
Yeah.
Um, Not only do we have some of Camblin's writings, which could be quite cryptic at times,
Right.
we have really detailed biography.
Okay.
We have some great reflections from a Zen perspective on some of his drawings.
Uh-huh.
There's even a really interesting YouTube discussion of one of his watercolors. And then we have some personal accounts and reviews of his huge body of work.
Yeah, I mean, he was incredibly prolific. He left behind thousands of artworks scattered all over the place.
Yeah, and they're not always easy to find.
Yeah.
His pieces are highly valued, and they're very rarely seen.
Right. So that deepens the mystery a little bit. But our mission is to try and distill the core insights, the recurring ideas, the moments that make you think, huh, I never thought of it that way, that define Camblin's art and his way of seeing the world. Let's dive in.
Sounds good.
All right, so to kind of set the stage, Bob Camblin was born in Oklahoma in 1928 into a family of artists.
Right, so from the very beginning, he's surrounded by art and creation.
Yeah, and even in high school, he was the art director for his yearbook.
Wow, so clearly he was already deeply involved in visual expression, even at that early age.
Yeah, and his early life in Pocket City seems to have been really influential.
Okay.
You have the Marland Estate, which is this really grand place that speaks to kind of like a bygone era in the iconic pioneer woman statue. And what's interesting is that the biography points out these really subtle references to his own personal pioneer woman symbol, which was actually his mother, Viva.
Of interest.
In some of his later work, and get this, the biography also mentions how seeing The Wizard of Oz in 1938, when he was just a kid, had this huge impact on his imagination.
I love that because you can really see how those early visual and cultural experiences kind of like seep into his later work, even when it gets very abstract.
Right, it's not so much about direct representation, but more like a deep underlying sensibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And another important influence was his friendship with Forrest Harrisberger, which started all the way back in high school art class
Wow.
and lasted for over 60 years.
That's amazing. They even spent time together in the Air Force Reserve. They were both activated for the Korean War.
And even during that time, they found ways to sketch together.
Really?
Yeah, the biography mentions them sketching the California coastline.
I mean, that's incredible to have that shared artistic focus during such a potentially difficult time. It must have really solidified their bond.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about Camblin's reading habits.
Right.
He was a voracious reader, and it really shows in his work.
The biography highlights his deep engagement with thinkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Right.
the wisdom of the I Ching, and the concise beauty of haiku and haiga. And you can see how these literary and philosophical explorations really informed his artistic approach.
For sure. It's all about simplicity
Yeah.
and finding those profound observations within the everyday.
Exactly. So after his military service, Camblin went to the Kansas City Art Institute.
Okay.
And guess what? He reconnected with Harrisberger there.
Of course.
And funnily enough, their roommate was an airliner pilot who had actually encouraged them to join the Air Force Reserve.
Oh, wow. That's ironic, considering they were later activated.
Yeah, but I think it just shows how Camblin was actively seeking out these diverse experiences and knowledge, whether it was through formal education travel or just his own personal reading, and that intellectual curiosity was really a driving force behind his artistic development.
Definitely. And we can't talk about Camblin without talking about his time in Italy.
Oh,
I would just imagine the impact of that experience. He was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study there after KCAI.
that's incredible.
The biography describes how deeply he immersed himself in the Uffizi Gallery, the heart of the Renaissance.
Oh, yeah.
But there's also this darker, more unexpected influence at play.
Oh, really?
The imagery of the Capuchin catacombs in Palermo, with all of those preserved mummies,
Oh, wow.
and these images really stuck with him. They became ingrained in his artistic memory.
So you have this juxtaposition of classical beauty and then this kind of macabre element.
Exactly, and the biography gives some really specific examples of how Italian Renaissance art worked its way into Camblin's pieces.
Like what?
Well, for example, Botticelli's Birth of Venus became this symbolic tribute to KPFT radio in Houston.
Okay.
It represented this idea of cultural nourishment.
Interesting.
And then Botticelli's Primavera inspired Camblin's Masked Flora, which is a piece that's full of hidden imagery.
Hidden imagery, that seems to be a recurring theme.
We'll definitely see more of that.
Now, before he moved to Houston, Camblin had a number of early exhibitions. He even showed at the Chicago Art Institute,
Wow.
which is a really big deal.
Absolutely.
And he also participated in some international shows.
So he was already making a name for himself.
Yeah, and he even had a brief stint as a map maker before he started teaching at different art schools across the country.
It seems like he was constantly exploring different avenues of creativity.
So by the time he gets to Rice University in Houston, he's already this really experienced artist and educator.
Right, he has all this travel, formal training, professional experience under his belt.
But it's at Rice where we see this noticeable shift in his artistic philosophy and the direction he's going.
Yeah, the biography talks about his St. Bambola series and this conscious effort to kind of turn off what he called his myth-making machine.
Okay, so what do you think he meant by myth-making machine? Was he feeling restricted by, the established narratives or expectations in the art world?
You hit the nail on the head. It seems like he was getting really disillusioned with the traditional art world, with galleries and museums and how things were done.
Mm,
The biography quotes him saying that he felt it was important for the artist to control the whole environment of their work
right.
and minimize any outside interference.
That makes sense.
He even came up with this idea of mistaking the tracks for the animal.
What did he mean by that?
It's like he's saying that the superficial aspects of the art world were obscuring the real essence of creation.
So the hype, the marketing, all that stuff was getting in the way of the actual art.
Exactly. And this connects to some of his later statements about art being about the lived experience rather than just the finished product.
Right. He wasn't interested in just churning out paintings to sell. He wanted to engage with the process and with ideas.
Absolutely. The biography also mentions his belief in faith and good work as stabilizing forces within this whole art world game.
It's like he's saying you have to believe in what you're doing and just keep working at it even when things get tough.
Yeah, and there's this really striking image he uses of muddy water settling.
What do you mean?
He talked about how obstacles can be transformed into opportunities if you just let things settle out.
Oh, I see.
And this actually inspired a whole series of paintings featuring jars of water.
That's cool. So it's like he was developing his own personal philosophy, a way to navigate the ups and downs of the art world.
Exactly. And after this period, we see the emergence of the 1967 Scarecrow series, which were inspired by Gunter Grass's dog years.
Okay.
Now, these weren't just literal scarecrows.
Right.
They were meant to symbolize a hastening of spring.
Like a renewal.
Exactly. And then this theme evolves into explorations of myths and legends, incorporating things like lobster shells and empty larva shells.
Those are some interesting choices.
Well, they're both really potent symbols of metamorphosis.
Okay, that makes sense. Now the scarecrows become even more interesting later on.
How so?
Well, he starts to describe them as sculptures, and he also begins incorporating text into his drawings. Yeah, but not just descriptive text. It was more like a kind of camouflage.
Interesting.
The biography mentions Tom Wolfe's The Painted Word and how Camblin was playing with the idea that sometimes the discourse around art can actually overshadow the art itself.
So he's using text as a way to challenge how we think about and interpret art.
Yeah, he's using text as clues in a mystery.
Huh.
Not always directly related to the image, but more like shapes to be enjoyed and interpreted personally.
So he's inviting the viewer to engage with the work on a deeper level.
Exactly. And he even describes this approach as guerrilla warfare on a visually saturated, word-oriented culture.
That's a great quote. So he's not afraid to provoke or challenge the status quo.
And to further encourage this deeper engagement, he started including what he called extra data problems in his drawings.
What are those?
They were like little codes or puzzles alongside these traps, which were essentially dead ends.
So it's almost like a game he's playing with the viewer.
Yeah, he's encouraging them to look closer, to think harder, to really work to understand the piece.
I love that. He's not making it easy for us.
The biography also mentions how he wanted to remake Goya in 20th century terms.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is, he wanted to question our commonly held views of reality, but in a way that was related to, but also distinct from surrealism.
Okay, so he's exploring the uncanny, the unexpected, the subconscious.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how he moved from these early social protest pieces to a fusion of social realism and non-objective art.
So he's experimenting with different styles and approaches.
Yeah, and he even drew inspiration from the work of Cremoni and Etruscan terracotta figurines.
So he's pulling from a wide range of influences.
It's clear that his trip to Italy had a lasting impact on him.
Absolutely. It introduced all these Byzantine and late medieval influences into his work.
And he started creating these huge drawings as ends in themselves, often incorporating what looked like corrections right into the pieces.
So he's not afraid to show the process to let the viewer see how the work came together.
Yeah. And then in the 1960s, he tries to combine the poetic suggestions of Hugo van der Goes with the emotional intensity of Goya.
Those are two very different artists.
They are, but I think that's what Camblin was all about, pushing boundaries, experimenting with different combinations.
Right, he's not afraid to mix things up.
And there's this fascinating detail about how the applied paper in his works would age over time, creating these subtle gradations.
It's like this unintentional collaboration between the artist and time itself.
Yeah, it's really cool. And then there's the enigmatic, a series of masks, which hints at hidden identities and layers of meaning.
So much to unpack there.
And then comes this period in the 1970s, which the biography describes as a mind-blowing discovery for Camblin.
What happened?
He realized he could turn art's subjective, symbolic, and decorative functions towards the mystical.
What do you mean?
He wanted to use art to evoke subjective states of mind in the viewer.
So he's going beyond just creating something visually appealing. He wants to create an experience.
Exactly. And this led to a really productive period for him with all sorts of stylistic explorations.
It sounds like he was really hitting his stride.
His drawings during this decade become increasingly cryptic.
Okay.
He's focusing on themes of the life cycle metamorphosis and the search for life's hidden mysteries.
So he's getting more philosophical, more introspective.
Yeah, and he's drawing inspiration from figures like Freud, De Chirico, Grunewald, Kazantzakis, and Grass.
That's quite a mix.
He was all about pulling from different sources, and then he had this really playful way of talking about his own work.
What do you mean?
He once said, "If you think it's funny, I'll get serious. And if you think it's serious, I'll make a joke of it."
That's brilliant. He's not letting us pin him down. He's always keeping us guessing.
Exactly. So in the 1980s, he starts interweaving drawing and watercolor techniques.
Okay.
He's creating these illusionistic surfaces that suggest there's more going on than meets the eye.
Like there are hidden depths to be explored.
Exactly. The biography talks about camouflaged images and the importance of looking beyond the obvious to appreciate the subtle draftsmanship.
So he's rewarding the viewer who takes the time to really look closely.
And sometimes these hidden images would only become apparent years or even decades later.
Wow, so it's a constant process of discovery.
Yeah, it's less about understanding the piece and more about knowing it through repeated engagement.
It's like the work is constantly evolving.
And then there's his collaborative events and exhibitions with Earl Staley and Joe Tate.
So he's not just working alone in the studio.
No, he's really interested in collaboration and in challenging the traditional art world.
How so?
Well, they worked under different names like B&E Productions and did shows with titles like Tattoo Show, Joe Tate's Backyard, and The Camping Show.
Those are some interesting titles.
They were really pushing the boundaries of what art could be and emphasizing the creative process and the shared experience.
It's like they're saying art isn't just about the finished product. It's about the journey, the collaboration, the community.
Exactly. And they even renovated a house together, which they called the Holding Firm.
That's great. They were really blurring the lines between art and life.
And often Camblin would sign his works as anonymous or anonymous artists.
So he's downplaying the individual ego. He's more interested in the collective effort.
Yeah. And then there's the Mouches Volantes series, which he developed with Nancy Giordano in the 1980s.
Tell me about that.
They were these arrangements of dots and dashes that created optical illusions.
Kind of like Escher or Dali.
Exactly. He was really interested in viewer participation in making the viewer an active part of the experience.
And he continued to explore these themes in later series like Big Owl and Descent from the Cross.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
What do you think are some of the key themes or philosophical ideas that we can take away from Camblin's work?
Well, one of the most important things is the fusion of art and philosophy.
Right.
He saw art as a way of asking questions and philosophy as a way of trying to find answers, even if those answers were always incomplete.
He also had this way of transforming ordinary things into symbols.
Like what?
Well, a figure 4 trap, a tattooed arm, a frog, they all become something more in his work.
It's like he's saying that everything has the potential to be meaningful if we just take the time to look at it in a different way.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of paradox made visible.
What do you mean?
Things like trap structures that don't move.
It's like he's playing with our expectations, challenging us to think differently.
Right. And he's also exploring themes of illusion and impermanence.
Like those vanishing acts we talked about.
Yeah, both literal and metaphorical. And then, of course, there's the recurring presence of traps.
Right, whether they're fear traps or time traps.
It's like he's commenting on the human condition, on the things that hold us back.
But even with all these explorations of the ephemeral and the paradoxical, there's this deep appreciation for stillness in his work.
Right. It's like he's saying that amidst all the chaos and uncertainty, there's this underlying peace that we can tap into.
And at its core, Camblin's art was about self-discovery and contemplation.
It was a journey inward.
Exactly, and it connects to ideas found in Zen and the I Ching, with their emphasis on intuition, interconnectedness, and the cyclical nature of experience.
And this idea of everyday enlightenment seems really central to his philosophy.
What do you mean by that?
He believed that we can find moments of enlightenment in the ordinary through our engagement with art and language.
So it's not about some grand mystical experience. It's
Right.
about finding the extraordinary in the everyday.
Exactly. And he embraced absurdity, humor, even decay, and he saw the beauty in the coexistence of opposites.
He also emphasized the importance of accepting impermanence.
Not as something to be feared, but as something that can actually be liberating.
Exactly, and his art really functions as a mirror, reflecting our own minds back to us.
It makes us question our assumptions, our beliefs, our way of seeing the world.
And he didn't want to give us easy answers.
He wanted us to linger in ambiguity to find meaning in the mundane.
And ultimately, his work is about reconnecting us with a sense of wonder and reflection,
It's about seeing the world with fresh eyes.
and realizing that enlightenment is a journey, not a destination.
Right, it's a process of continuous unfolding. Now, one thing I found really interesting was his distinction between Zen seeing and intellectual seeing.
What did he mean by that?
Well, Zen seeing was about experiencing the art directly, intuitively, without overthinking it,
Okay.
whereas intellectual seeing involved analyzing the techniques, the historical context, the symbolism.
And he felt that sometimes that intellectual approach could get in the way of the true experience of the art.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, just look, don't think so much.
It's about feeling the art rather than just dissecting it.
Now, what about Camblin's later life and legacy?
Well, after he left academia in 1976, he lived a pretty nomadic existence.
Traveling and creating.
Exactly. And eventually moved to the Oregon coast and then Louisiana with his wife, Nancy. Sadly, he lost touch with a lot of his friends from Houston during this time.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. But he did return to Houston for a short time before he passed away.
And there were efforts to organize a retrospective of his work?
Right, but it seems like it never quite came together while he was alive.
It's a shame, but his fellow artists speak so highly of him and his influence.
Yeah, Earl Staley actually credits Camblin with teaching him how to draw and paint through their collaborations.
Wow, so even though he might not have been a household name, he clearly left a mark on the art world.
Absolutely. He was a true innovator, and he constantly challenged the status quo.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Bob Camblin had this really unique and multifaceted artistic vision.
Right. His work is full of these paradoxes and layers of meaning.
He embraced impermanence, he searched for meaning, he played with ideas.
And he did it all with a sense of humor and a deep respect for the creative process.
And for you, the listener, who is always looking to learn and grow and experience those aha moments, Camblin's work offers so much to explore.
It's challenging, thought-provoking, and ultimately really rewarding.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways from Camblin's philosophy is the importance of slowing down and contemplating the ordinary.
He said, "Much better than arguing is to look at my watercolor palette."
It's about appreciating the simple things and finding beauty in the everyday.
So as we leave you with this final thought, consider how Camblin's idea of stepping off the train of thought might apply to your own pursuit of knowledge and understanding.
What trains of thought do you need to step away from in order to gain a fresh perspective?
And we encourage you to seek out more information about Bob Camblin and maybe even see his artwork in person if you have the chance.
It's a journey worth taking.
Definitely.
All right, that's it for our deep dive into the world of Bob Camblin. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.